On behalf of my colleague, Stephen Rothstein, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all my library and foundation colleagues, thank you for coming this evening. I also want to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters at the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. I'm also delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online, including those of you watching from the John F. Kennedy Hyannis Museum. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening, and when Q&A starts, we will invite those of you who are joining us in person tonight to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. Eileen McNamara, I should know how to say that word, shouldn't I? Eileen McNamara has kindly agreed to sign copies of her most recent book after tonight's program. Our bookstore has copies available for purchase if you are interested. Now, history has a way of overlooking women. Even the word "his story" seems to reflect this inequity. But the narrative is changing. However slowly, we are progressing to tell a full story. Tonight, we will be exploring and challenging that view by looking at the life of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, a life which, described by our panelist, fought against the traditional view of women as, quote, invisible or interchangeable. Quote, that was the lot of the daughters of Joseph P. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, Eileen writes, relegated to the role of decorative accessories to the outsized ambitions, first of their father and then their brothers. But, as she describes, in the case of Eunice, that image was wildly out of focus. There was nothing silent or ornamental about the fifth daughter of Joe and Rose Kennedy's 9 children. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome Eileen McNamara back to the library. She is the director of the journalism program at Brandeis University, where she has been a professor of the practice of journalism since 2007. She's an award-winning reporter and former columnist for the Boston Globe, where she won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary and contributed to the coverage of the clergy sex abuse scandal in the Archdiocese of Boston. Her writing continues to appear there and on Cognoscenti, the commentary pages of WBUR.org, Boston's national public radio station. I'm also pleased to welcome back our moderator for the evening. Larry Tye is a New York Times best-selling author whose most recent book was Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon. The author of 6 other books, he also runs the Boston-based Health Coverage Fellowship, which trains 12 medical journalists a year from newspapers, radio stations, and TV outlets nationwide. From 1986 to 2001, Larry was an award-winning reporter at the Boston Globe. He has been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and has taught journalism at BU, Northeastern, and Tufts. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you. What I want to start by doing actually tonight is tell you why Eileen McNamara is the perfect person to have written this book. Number one, she worked for a very long time at the Boston Globe, and unlike most people at the Globe who were so close to the Kennedys that they were afraid to ever say anything critical about the Kennedys, Eileen McNamara covered the Kennedys for years and knew their story intimately, the good and the bad of the Kennedy story. A second reason is that she has lived this history. She isn't somebody who came in from out of town and had to learn how to talk like Kennedys or understand the way that they talked. She is of Cambridge and of Wellesley and of Boston. A third reason is that anybody who read her column all those years knows that Eileen is a great writer. She is the perfect person to be telling you the Eunice story, because she's also a strong feminist, and she's of the not afraid to tell what you know kind of mode of an author. But the most important reason, and the most important reason that you buy a book, like all of you are going to do when we're done here tonight, is that she has a point of view. And anybody who has met Eileen for 13 seconds knows that she's got a strong point of view of just about anything that she comes into contact with. And you will see in reading the Eunice story that she's not only got a point of view, but she is trying to sell you on her title in a way that only Eileen could make that ring true, which is the thesis that Eunice Kennedy Shriver, coming from this extraordinary family, is the most interesting story in the family and has the legacy that lasted the longest and arguably means the most. And we're going to get to that thesis in a minute and see whether it holds up. And I was going to come and actually challenge her to a debate about whether Bobby mattered more than Eunice.
Here it comes.
But I'm not going to do it. I'm going to hold, this isn't about me, this is about her.
That's right, Larry.
So what I want to do is start actually by asking her a question. And the short question is, why this book in this subject? But more importantly, tell us the answer to that question through taking us through the process. What you had access to that nobody has ever seen, and what you saw in these papers that you found.
So why Eunice? The obvious answer to that is that this extraordinary woman has never been written about. Nobody knows her story. People think she's the lovely lady that started Special Olympics. She's a lot of things, a lovely lady, not so much. Tough, fierce, beautiful, but not easy, not an easy woman. But she did so much more in her life than Special Olympics that we didn't know about. And finding that out was not easy, because when you're a woman, even a woman in the Kennedy family, you don't necessarily leave the same paper trail. I'm sure researching Bobby was much easier. I'm just saying. But on the other hand, she did keep meticulous records in her life, but not even her family knew that. Upstairs in the archives here, the wonderful archives at the Kennedy Library, in a storage room were 33 boxes that nobody had really ever gone through.
Publicly accessible boxes.
Not publicly accessible boxes, because they were storing them here for the Shriver family, but the Shrivers had never deeded them to the library, so the library wouldn't allow me to see them, even with the permission of the Shriver children. So we had to actually physically remove the boxes from here to Brandeis so that I could read them. And Tim Shriver said to me, Tim, one of her sons who now runs Special Olympics, I don't know what you think you're going to find in those boxes, Eileen. If I had to guess, they're old VHS tapes of Maria on the Today Show. Well, there was a lot in those boxes, and I didn't come across one VHS tape of Maria, not one. It was amazing. She kept diaries when she was a schoolgirl in London. There were letters from Lyndon Johnson in there. It was a remarkable trove of material to look through.
So before I ask the next question, I want to ask, are there any Shrivers in the audience here? Great, so I'm safe to ask anything that I want. So the question is, what was it getting access to this material with the Kennedys and Shrivers? They're all wonderful, they save lots of papers, but there's always a backstory on what it was like dealing with them to get the access that you wanted. How easy and how much insight did it give you into the family just trying to get that access?
Well, you know, I think that all Kennedys and all Shrivers and all Lawfords and all Smiths are a little dubious when a journalist approaches them and says, you know, I'd really like to write a biography of your mother. There's more than a few books out there on various Kennedys that don't take a particularly sympathetic tack. Not everything in this book is especially sympathetic to Eunice either. But I wanted to argue that you want a real journalist to do this, somebody that is going to weigh your mother's record. You don't want a hagiography. You can hire someone to do that. But let me see these papers, and I'll tell you what's in them. But give me a shot at it, because I have some credibility. And it took 2 years. Took 2 years of letter writing, phone conversations, emails, a trip to California to meet Maria and Bobby. It took a lot of work to convince them that I was the real deal, that I didn't have an agenda. I didn't know their mother. I knew probably about what everybody in the room knew about her. But I knew there was more there. So getting the papers was key. And I pretty much told Simon & Schuster, unless I got access to the papers, I wasn't going to do it. Because you really had to know her. The only way to know her is to read that material.
So this book is an extraordinary book about Eunice, but it's also a lens into the rest of the Kennedys. And before we get to Eunice, I would love to hear what you came away thinking. What did the Eunice story tell you about who Rose was as a mother and as a person?
Rose. Well, most of us of a certain age came of age with an impression about Mrs. Kennedy that I think was manufactured. And it was manufactured by institutions that are devoted to manufacturing those kinds of images. And Joe Kennedy was a master of public relations, as you know. And the idea that Rose Kennedy was the national matriarch strikes you as ironic when you read her personal letters to Eunice as Eunice is growing up. You think, could be a little more present and could be a little more supportive.
Did you come away liking Rose?
No, not especially. No, I didn't. I mean, I think she had a lot on her plate. She had 9 children, but I don't think she raised them. And I think we've been told a story about how those children were raised that I don't think is exactly accurate.
So somebody who had arguably an even bigger influence on Eunice's life was Joe, and
yes.
Joe's expectations for his daughters versus his sons. Tell us what you came away thinking about Joe after this.
I would say this about Rose before I turn my attention to Joe, is that she did get her incredible piety from her mother. But she's a very different Catholic than Rose was. Rose's piety was passive, and Eunice's was quite active. She saw the church, and she saw Christ in the world in action, not in church.
And was that in reaction to Rose?
No, I don't think it was in reaction to her. I think it was in reaction to Joe. Because the political path that was open to her brothers was not open to her because of her gender. She simply wasn't seen by her father. And so while he was busily plotting the futures of his sons, she was desperately trying to get his attention. He did put her in charge of the Kennedy Foundation that was named for Joseph P. Jr., who was, of course, killed in combat in World War II. But typically, on the letterhead of the Joseph P. Kennedy Foundation, for decades, it either read John F. Kennedy, President, Robert F. Kennedy, President, Edward M. Kennedy, President. And none of them had much to do with the Kennedy Foundation. It was Eunice's show from 1957 on. She ran it. She determined what it did, and it did remarkable things.
So can you talk to us, arguably the Kennedy who Eunice's life, she lived most in reaction to in a before and after Joe Kennedy period, was her sister Rosemary. Talk to us about Eunice's reaction to Rosemary and dealing with guilt with Rosemary. And
I think that's the record she doesn't leave. She leaves these remarkably detailed diaries in the run-up to World War II, for instance, where she has lots of things to say about Hitler, about what's happening in London, where, as you'll remember, her father was the U.S. ambassador to the Court of St. James. But she's not introspective. None of them are. But I think probably Eunice is the least introspective of them, at least in any way that you would see displayed even in a private writing. She writes, for instance, this is something she does. She lives with Jack. When Jack Kennedy first goes to Congress in 1947, they have roommates together. They share a townhouse in Georgetown. And she takes meticulous notes after every dinner party. Who said what jokes were told. She writes down the jokes in all their detail, a few of them off color. She talks about how someone enters a room, how they make conversation. I think she was very awkward socially, and so she used those social occasions to see how other people functioned so that she could adopt the same behavior. But insights into what she was thinking about something like Rosemary, you're not going to find in her writings. There's a big gap, and I suspect we could fulfill it upstairs when the Kennedy family decides that all the pink slips that they have removed from the archives, from the personal papers of Joseph and Rose, when they restore those and make them available to historians, we'll know more about the Rosemary story. We know that she was lobotomized, of course, in 1941. The lobotomy is in November. Eunice transfers to Stanford from Manhattanville in January of 1942. Some historians have argued that she was so traumatized by what happened to her older sister that she wanted to get as far away as she could go. But one of the great things about access to these private papers is it's clear that Jack encouraged her to go to Stanford a full year before, and that was in process. I don't think she learned about the lobotomy at the earliest until 1949. And we know that because in Rose's papers, there was one letter after Rosemary's personal physician died prematurely. The nuns at St. Coletta's wrote a letter to Rose saying, we need to find a new physician. And Rose said, I'm going to refer this letter to my daughter Eunice because she was involved in the original decision about a doctor for Rosemary when she first went to St. Coletta's. That was 1949. So I think she knew then.
So can you start out by anybody who has worked with the Kennedys, whether you're a reporter or whether you're a library official, knows that it's exciting and it is challenging. What was it like trying to get access to the papers, trying to get cooperation? Can you give us a little background on working with the family and when they opened up and when they wouldn't?
I think it really did. It took a long time, and this is really embarrassing. I thought I had written these remarkable letters laying out my credentials. I thought the Pulitzer might count for something. But it really wasn't until Spotlight came out, and all the Shrivers went to the movies that weekend, apparently, and I started getting emails saying, oh my God, I saw you in Spotlight. And I believe my character was mentioned for 30 seconds. So I'm very, very grateful to Spotlight because it opened the door.
So can I just say, so her character may have been mentioned for 30 seconds, but she was, Spotlight would never have happened.
No.
It would never have happened because she did the first story that convinced the new editor who was coming to Boston that this was a story worth pursuing, and she was the specter the whole time that they were out there tracking things down. It was Eileen. I mean, nothing would have happened with it, and I think that the...
Thank you. Thank you.
So which was more of a challenge, trying to get the Catholic Church to open up on Spotlight or the Kennedy family on this book?
I'm not going there. I'm not going there.
So when you got access to these extraordinary files, there must have been a million things that delighted and surprised you. Can you tell us about some of the things that were your favorites that you were seeing?
Well, the chaos of the papers, I think, was the most exciting thing. You would never know what you'd find. There'd be all these old crumbling newspaper clippings from London. And like in the middle, there would be this personal letter from a woman who had been a spy for Japan during World War II and had been sentenced to prison at Alderson, the federal penitentiary for women in West Virginia. Eunice befriended her, and there's this exchange of letters. Her name was Velvalee Dickinson. Velvalee, what a name. I mean, you can't beat that name. And she was paroled the year after Eunice worked at the prison, and Eunice got her a job with Catholic Charities in New York. Who knew that? Who knew that? That she was a lifetime friend of a World War II spy, and she changed her name to Catherine Dickerson. I think she figured out that Velvely would be a tip-off. People might connect her to her previous crimes. But there she is in the bride's registry, in the gift registry. She gave her stationery from Tiffany's. So she had taste.
She did have taste. So Eunice seems like, before we get to all of your conclusions on who Eunice was, can we talk a little bit about Eunice's relationship with other people and how she's a lens into some of the rest of the Kennedy family? And can you start out with Joe and Jack, the two older boys, and what her interactions were like with them and what you learned that was new and interesting about them?
I did know how close she was to Jack. I mean, people in the family told me that Jack adored her. And when their older sister Kathleen died tragically in an airplane crash in 1948, Eunice was the next able-bodied sister, and they became extremely close. She, in the 1946 campaign, was the one that Bobby sent or Joe sent to stand in for Jack when he had competing engagements and needed somebody to give a speech. It was Eunice that he sent. He respected her political judgment. She was a great strategist. Those famous tea parties, I didn't know they were Eunice's idea. She and a Cambridge city councilor cooked up that idea. And all of the male advisors to Jack Kennedy said, now that's a waste of money. Let's spend it on beer and have a beer bus for all the GIs returning from World War II. And Eunice insisted, no, it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to bring out all of the women who are registered Democrat in the 11th district. And some of you may remember the name Droney. Droney was the Middlesex district attorney later in his life, but earlier he was just a young lawyer in Cambridge. Absolutely thought this would not work. And it was on a Saturday, and in the Sunday papers, there were photographs of lines going around the corner of the Commander Hotel in Harvard Square. All these women dressed in their finery to go have tea with Jack Kennedy's sisters and his mother.
So in the White House years, Jack and Bobby used to joke about who was going to have to deal with Eunice when she came to see them, that they knew she was going to come and she had an agenda and that she was not going to be easy. Did she have a sense, how they were dealing with her, and did she have a sense that she ought to have been there and not these two?
Yeah, I think she had a sense of the latter. Yeah. And I would say, with all due respect, Larry, that I wouldn't characterize that that's the way that Jack thought about her. In every secondary source that I've read about the relationship between these people, she's an irritant. She's a nudge. Oh my God, give her what she wants, get Eunice off the phone. Maybe they gave Eunice what she wanted because Eunice knew what worked. Maybe they respected Eunice's opinion. I've heard you lately a lot on CNN talking about the Kennedys and talking about the relationship between the two brothers. And in fact, I heard you Sunday night say, and I think you were absolutely right, that the Cuban Missile Crisis was like bonded those brothers in a way that probably no siblings were bonded in that family. But I couldn't help but notice every week of the CNN special on the Kennedys that there's no mention of his relationship with Eunice during the White House years. And you know, there was a presidential commission created in the White House at the urging of Eunice Shriver that she made her brother sign off on before he took the oath of office. It was called the President's Commission on Mental Retardation. And it led to all the legislation, federal legislation, that still currently exists, that deinstitutionalized children that were kept in these Dickensian institutions, that created group homes, that gave federal money for the first time to states. Most states didn't have departments of what we then called mental retardation and we now call intellectual disabilities. They didn't exist in most states. They existed after this legislation passed. Who wrote that legislation? Who created the panel that was full of the experts that crafted it? I don't know why that didn't get into the CNN documentary. I just don't know why.
So I don't want to defend CNN, and I have no idea what's coming, but there are 3 parts left.
Yeah.
Don't
hold your breath.
How much of all of the things that you just talked about, how much was that not just an outgrowth of Rosemary and her relationship with Rosemary, but an outgrowth of her guilt in terms of what she did or didn't do during the years her dad was alive? And talk to us about why somebody as strong-willed as Eunice, until her dad had his stroke, went along with the rest of the family.
I think you have to understand who he was, and I think you do. He had a powerful, powerful hold over that family. I don't think anybody defied him. I don't think Jack defied him. I don't think anybody defied him. He was the patriarch. No matter how she felt, she would have done what her father told her to do. And if he said to her that Rosemary was off limits, who knows if she visited her privately. She lived in Chicago, not far from the institution. There's no records left at the institution, so it's impossible to know. But, you know, the Wisconsin primary was key to Jack Kennedy's primary success. And she was right there. And the district that Sargent Shriver and Eunice Shriver were assigned to canvass was the district where Jefferson, Wisconsin is. Is it possible she never went to see her sister? I don't think so. I think she went. But I can't tell you that she went. And if she didn't go, I can understand that too, because her father would not have been pleased.
So how much of the rest of her life and all of her extraordinary work on those issues were compensating for?
Yeah, I think some of it was compensation, but I think there's guilt. I'm not going to psychoanalyze her. There was some guilt. There was anger. A lot of it was anger at her father that was displaced in some ways. And I think there was rage. If you want to understand Eunice Shriver, you have to understand rage. And it wasn't just rage at how Rosemary was treated and what fate befell her. It was that all of these children and adults all around the country, 5 million in 1960, had nothing. Children with intellectual disabilities didn't have a right to a public school education until 1975. And they wouldn't have had it then if it wasn't for Eunice Shriver.
So we've talked a little bit about Rose and relationship to Joe and the siblings. Arguably a more important person in her world and shaping her world and for the rest of her life was Sargent Shriver.
Yes.
What can you tell us about their relationship, what role each played, and the support they gave to one another?
They're a remarkable political partnership. They're unlike anything else in this family. They're unlike any other couple that I've encountered in my life. He adored her. His love letters to her, and the stack was quite large, was in her personal papers. And they're just remarkable, the level of devotion and persistence. 7 years he dated her, 7 years, and she wasn't having it.
Because?
She wanted to be a nun. And I think she devoutly felt that she had a vocation. It's not unusual that any of you who happen to have gone to Catholic school know that it isn't as if the nuns don't encourage you to think that you might have a vocation. And they encouraged the young girls who were at Roehampton, the Sisters of the Sacred Heart, that taught her at Roehampton in London. And I met a wonderful woman when I went to Roehampton to look at the archives there, who sat in the last row of the study hall beside Eunice. She was a few years younger than Eunice. And she said during our school days, everyone knew that Eunice had a vocation. And as it turned out, Dorothy Bell, who was the young girl who sat beside her, did become a Sister of the Sacred Heart. And she said, I was astounded to find out that she did not become a nun, and I did, because I was much more sure of her vocation than I was of my own.
Amazing. So he was extraordinarily persistent. 7 years, but when they get married, this was a great, an uncharacteristically Kennedy marriage?
Oh, very uncharacteristic, I think. I mean, I think before we marry them, you have to know how did she get convinced? I mean, she thought the world of Sargent Shriver. Like her, he was a devout Catholic. They went to Mass together every Sunday. She lived in Chicago then. And he was running the merchandise mart for Joe. So he would be essentially marrying the boss's daughter. And they had a lot of fun together. But she wouldn't give up the idea of the convent until Joe put in a call to Father Theodore Hesburgh at Notre Dame. In 1952, Father Hesburgh had just been named the president of Notre Dame, and they were big Notre Dame football fans. And Sarge and Eunice used to go down quite a lot to see the games. So he invited her for a little private conversation at Notre Dame in 1952. And she went, and Father Hesburgh dined out on this story for about 40 years with his fellow priests, and several of whom told it to me. But he always told Kennedy biographers that, oh, well, of course it was a love match. It was wonderful. Sarge was just persistent and won the day. So when I called Father Hesburgh, I said, you know, Father, this story's been around for a long time because you've told it so often. And I would really hate to think that you were telling tales. Long pause. Well, you know, Eileen, everyone's dead. I guess we can put it on the record now. Yes, I told Eunice she didn't have a vocation to be a nun. She had a vocation to marry Sargent Shriver and have his children. I was astounded. I mean, even though I'd heard the story, I was astounded to hear it. And I said, and you didn't feel a little queasy about being Joe Kennedy's emissary? He said, I would have if I hadn't known what a wonderful man he was, and if I hadn't seen them together and known that they would make a wonderful marriage. And I think they did. They did.
So you're a much better reporter than I am, and I spent a long time trying to understand the relationship between why Bobby Kennedy so despised Sargent Shriver and tried to undermine him. When Lyndon Johnson was looking in 1964 for a vice president, and he brought up the name Sargent Shriver, Bobby Kennedy said, it will be a real Kennedy, meaning him, Bobby, or it will be nobody. What did you understand about that antipathy and where Eunice fit into it? Did she she adored Bobby? She adored Bobby,
and she adored Sarge too, but not in quite the same way. I mean, Sarge's friends, when I interviewed his friends from the Kennedy administration from that period, they always felt that Sarge got a bum deal, that he was always like the secondary Kennedy. He wasn't like really accepted as part of the family. But I've read your biography of Bobby, so I know that Bobby evolved himself. He wasn't the liberal icon in 1964 that he was in 1968. And I think he thought of Sarge as the house communist. Because in Chicago, Sargent Shriver sat on the Interracial Council, the Catholic Interracial Council. He and Eunice took Black adolescent girls into their home once they left the reformatory where Eunice volunteered, so that they would have some transitional housing. Sarge used to say, I'd be sitting at my desk at home on Lakeshore Drive doing some paperwork, and there'd be a knock on the door, and I'd open the door, and there'd be a girl with a little suitcase, and I'd think, oh, Lord, one of Eunice's. And they took them in, and they mentored them, and they treated them like family. Bobby and Maria, who were young, but they were the only two there in Chicago. They remember the girls at the dinner table. They never knew exactly why they were there, and they came with them to the Cape. I think Sarge was much more liberal than the Kennedys, much more liberal.
He was, and I think about the only thing that I didn't see Bobby evolve on was Sargent Shriver. But
Right.
So I want to get to some of the issues that made Eunice so incredibly compelling as an advocate and a person. And I want to read a few of my favorite lines from the books on different themes and would love you to comment on.
Sure.
This is what Eileen McNamara wrote on Eunice's competitiveness. She was the best sailor in a group of natural mariners, the best tennis player among siblings who had volleyed on the grass courts of Wimbledon and the clay at Cap Antibes.
Yeah.
And she was trained by her father not to lose, which she rarely did. Despite a physical constitution so delicate, the family called her puny Uni.
Yes.
Talk to us about her competitiveness.
She was fierce. I mean, I think, I say in the book that the word I heard most often in interviews to describe Eunice is the word that Ted Kennedy first used in describing her to me when I covered Congress during the Reagan administration and got to know the senator. She was formidable. And she was formidable because she didn't think that there was an excuse for anything. All right, you are a very sickly young woman who, at 5'10", usually weighed around 105 pounds. Wow. I mean, that's the person maybe with an eating disorder too, but was there an eating disorder? I think there possibly was an eating disorder because her mother was fixated on their weight. She weighed them constantly when they were children. But there was also, she had all kinds of physical stomach ailments, gastrointestinal problems, Addison's disease, as Jack had Addison's disease. And because Joe's ethic was that it only counts if you come in first, she imbibed that. And she was not going to let Jack come in first all the time. She was going to come in first. So she was very competitive athletically, as she was politically. She was going to get done what she wanted to get done.
So could we talk for one quick second? So you mentioned the idea Rose was obsessively weighing the kids.
Yeah.
But the boys were fat. Ted was
right.
an
Teddy
overweight kid.
Was fat.
Teddy was fat.
Yeah.
Jack was not
not
thin.
He was a little thin until he started taking steroids for his Addison's disease.
So was there a reaction that the weighing had a different implication for what the girls should weigh?
Yeah, I think so. I think it did. And you can see, I mean, if I don't seem as warm as many biographers toward Rose, it's because of these letters that she would write to Eunice. I think she compared her unfavorably to Kathleen, who was more feminine and flirtatious. Eunice wasn't going there. She wasn't flirtatious. She wasn't feminine. She wore men's trousers, and she played a very vigorous game of tennis. She drove men off the court nearly in tears. I mean, people would feign ankle injuries so not to have to play tennis with Eunice.
But that in the Kennedy family, and given the way the Kennedys reacted to the boys and the girls on the nine, that was needed to have her voice, wasn't it, the competitiveness?
I think so, but I also think it was a little bit, as I say, I think she was an angry person on lots of levels. Maybe it's me, but, you know, I'm Irish. We're not all beauties, right? You know, so, I mean, some of us are, not all of us. But you look at photographs of the Kennedy girls, and when they're young women, and the Kennedys write a narrative, I think, or wrote a narrative, Joe wrote a narrative of this, and every family member, every child has a little story about them. And as historians dig in, these stories aren't really true. I mean, Joe Jr., handsome, athletic, mean, a bully, threw Teddy off a sailboat because he was too heavy and he was weighing him down during a race. That's the Atlantic Ocean, people.
An anti-Semite?
And, well, yeah, maybe. And also, Eunice fought fiercely. This is another interesting thing about her. She fought fiercely to keep a letter that Joe Jr. wrote before World War II out of Hostages of Fortune, which is a wonderful, wonderful collection of Joe Kennedy Sr.'s correspondence that was compiled by Amanda Smith, Gene Smith's daughter. It's a really brilliant piece of work that she did when she was studying at Harvard for her PhD. And the letter talks about his admiration for a lot of things in the Third Reich. And one of the things that he admired most was this policy of sterilization of people who were defective and unfit. And you can understand why Eunice said that can't be published. I've spent my life trying to get people not to see others as defective.
So I want to read something else that you wrote, but before I do, I want to say and I'm not representing Simon & Schuster up here, but I want to say that I've read, one of the things you do when you write a book is you read lots of other books written on that topic. And I read probably, I think I ended up giving away 500 books at the end of finishing my book. And I've read everything that's been written about Eddie Kennedy. And the combination of writing and original reporting in your book was something extraordinary that I didn't see in 500 books that I had read on the Kennedys. You told us a news story about not just Eunice, but about the whole family. But I want to read something that you wrote about their activism. And so rather than telling you that she wrote really well, I want to show you another little piece of her writing. And Eileen writes, "There is little doubt that at least some of that passion was private anger, the anger you just talked about, redirected to the public sphere. Anger at the adored but autocratic father who lobotomized a beloved sister. Anger at the pious but passive mother who submitted to Rosemary's long banishment from the family. Anger at herself and her siblings for allowing themselves to edit the inconvenient Rosemary out of their lives for so many years." And you called it anger. I would call it passion or appropriate anger. Talk about sort of, this was anger that somebody should have felt at all the things that she was watching going on in her family. Tell us about it.
Well, you know, there's a letter that Joe Sr. writes to one of the nuns at St. Coletta's that I think is his justification for the banishment of Rosemary. Rosemary's situation, resolving Rosemary's situation by allowing her to live at St. Coletta's, has freed all of them to fulfill their own destinies. And I think that was probably true for Jack and maybe Bobby. It allowed them on the public stage. But it didn't fulfill Eunice's mission. What was her mission? She wasn't going to have a public political career. But ironically, Joe didn't know this, but he did by banishing Rosemary. Find a way for Eunice to channel her social conscience and her passion in a public way and to serve the public good in no less a way than Jack did or Bobby did or Teddy did. And I would argue in a way that's much more consequential. She changed the way we look at an entire population of people.
She did. So I want to read you, I had a lot of favorites, but this was probably my favorite paragraph in the book, and this is what you were just talking about. You say, "If that girl had been born with balls, she would have been a hell of a politician," Joe Kennedy is reputed to have said of Eunice. an observation that reflected less on her talents than on the limits of his imagination. The self-made millionaire could envision either of his older sons the first Catholic president, but couldn't picture his daughter in public office. Breaking barriers was for Kennedy men, not Kennedy women. Men play and women pray. That was Joe Kennedy's attitude towards his wife and his daughters. But there was one daughter who broke out of that, and she became arguably one of the most effective politicians in the family. How did she manage? Was it just determination? What was there in Eunice that let her do this despite Joe's constraints?
Because she was smart as hell. I mean, look at them all. She went to Stanford. She transferred from Manhattanville, lovely school, to Stanford. She came back from Stanford to finish up her degree, and she went to Radcliffe. She was smart, she was savvy, she was ambitious. It wasn't polite to be ambitious as a woman in the 50s or the 40s, but she was ambitious. She wanted what her father was laying out for her brothers. She knew she couldn't get it the way they were getting it. So she just wormed her way behind the scenes. And she got what she wanted. In 1960, she went to Jack and said, "Why isn't there a National Institute for Child Health and Human Development?" Everything stems from that. Why don't we know anything about human development? This wasn't just about her concern for mental retardation. This was her concern about everything, about childhood illnesses and diseases. How did she convince Jack? She said, "Jack, you and Jackie have had 2 tragic losses. One a miscarriage, one a stillbirth." And Jack, on a sailboat in Nantucket Sound, said, well, would it help to... And yes, she said it would help if researchers focused on prenatal care, focused on infant development. Of course it would matter. And what do we have now? We have we have an Institute of Child Health and Human Development that is called the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Institute for Child Health and Human Development. She created that. The research that has happened there has been extraordinary. The Kennedys' son, Patrick, died of hyaline membrane disease, of a deficiency in lung development. No one dies of that today. Because of the work that went on at the institute that does not exist except for Eunice Kennedy Shriver.
So when I hear your passion for her here tonight, and when I read that passion in the book, I'd have to be an idiot not to say somebody that I'm reminded of is somebody named Eileen McNamara as I read about Eunice Kennedy Shriver. How much did you see yourself in her, and how much did that drive you in this process?
Well, I can't play tennis, and I don't know how to sail. And I don't weigh 105 pounds, for that matter. I mean, so not so much I didn't see myself, but I did see myself in her. She bristled a lot at obstacles that women face in the world. And I don't know if that building was still open across the street on Morrissey Boulevard. I think they probably remember me bristling a little bit, you know, once or twice. So I identified with her in that way. I believe in social justice too, and I think she was just an amazing force of nature in fighting for it.
So I think Eunice also captures it. I think every Kennedy, and every Kennedy certainly among the 9 children of Rose and Joe, was a set of contradictions. They were a combination of some blend of god-awful, disagreeable, and transcendent good. And Eunice seemed brilliantly to capture both of those. Can you talk about this? Eunice as contradiction and Eunice as Kennedy contradiction?
Yeah, absolutely. I interviewed lots and lots of her assistants. And it was easy because she had lots and lots of assistants because they quit regularly because they couldn't work for her. One told me that she came to her and after 2 weeks on the job and said, Mrs. Shriver, I had to let you know that I spend my lunch hour every day at the church next door praying for the fortitude to get through one more day working for you. And Mrs. Shriver sat behind her desk and said, could we take dictation now? So, and I don't think she would, but I interviewed many assistants who told me stories like that, but who also said, but I loved her so for the work that she did and the energy she brought to it. I don't think she was mean. I think she expected everyone to have the same sense of urgency that she had. And no living human being has that sense of urgency. So I think she had impossible expectations for her children as well as for her employees. She wanted the world. She didn't believe in no. She didn't hear no. And that can be tough. That can be tough to take.
It can be really tough to take. So I would love to know where you started out in terms of the book process, liking or not liking Eunice, and where you ended up.
I didn't know her well enough to like her or not like her. I heard a lot of these stories about people having to go pray to get through the day, and then I didn't like her. But then I got to know her, and I really like her. I really like her. I wouldn't want to hang out with her. I don't think she'd want to hang out with me. I don't think we're not alike in lots of ways, so we probably wouldn't be pals. But there is a former senator who was a key figure in the Kennedy administration who said to me about the Shrivers, there is one person in the world that I wish I could bring back to have dinner with, and that's Sargent Shriver. And there's one person in the world I would never bring back to have dinner with, and that's Eunice Shriver.
Wow.
And I wrote that down furiously. And he said, you know, maybe you don't want to put that in the book. I don't think the kids would like it. And the kids wouldn't shrug. I think they understood that about their mom. I think they knew that.
So is it accidental when you talk about the kids, they've all had something to write as well as to say about their father, about their mother, a lot more silence. Was it difficult to get them to open up and really talk to you about what they thought about their mother?
No. Surprisingly, at the beginning it was. I mean, until Spotlight, thank you again, Spotlight. When I think I got some legitimacy, they were very candid. They were very candid. Bobby, said, when I think of her now, I think she was probably a working addict because she was on all kinds of medication, which Ethel Kennedy told me she would take in fistfuls, and you would never know what the hell's in there. And Ted had a nurse practitioner who worked for him on disability issues, who was dispatched regularly to the Shriver household to readjust her meds. So I think they were honest about their mother. They saw her clearly. They admired her fiercely. They adored her, but they ran when she was coming. They all describe her favorite expression when they were children was, get on to yourself. I don't even know what that means. And Maria describes it as, get up, get out, do something, seize the day. Nobody sat in front of a television set in that house. Nobody lounged around. All of them told me they have spent their young adult lives learning how to relax.
So I want to just make one more editorial comment on Eileen. She makes all of those impressions that she drew out of the children sound like they were easy. And again, no Shrivers in the audience, but the doing anything with any generation of the Kennedys or Shrivers is never easy, and it is a tribute to her skills as a journalist and an intrepid researcher that not only did they talk to her and talk to her as openly as they did, but that they opened up these papers that had been there forever, that so many people were trying. So that doesn't require any comment on your part. I want to end my part of the questioning with the most important question, which is the thesis of your book, of your title and subtitle, is that Eunice wasn't just the equal of her brothers, but that she ended up mattering more. Take your best shot at telling us why in this family.
Okay. The subtitle of the book is The Kennedy Who Changed the World. And that's not my subtitle. I went back through my notes as we were trying to come up with a title for this book, and it was remarkable how many times that expression was used by people. Lowell Weicker once gave a commencement speech. He's the former governor and senator from Connecticut. He gave a commencement speech in which he said to young people graduating into the world, people will tell you you can change the world. And you won't believe them because it sounds extraordinary. I'm going to tell you about a woman who did. And it's a wonderful speech. And it turned out that that was the impression of an awful lot of folks who knew her, worked with her, were terrified of her on Capitol Hill, who cut an appropriation she wanted. There are more than 170 countries in the world, including South Africa, China, Russia, where children who are locked away are not locked away anymore. And you can say, well, the Special Olympics didn't do that. Yes, it did, because Eunice Shriver told all of us to value every human life. And people listened to her. And she went into places where you are not supposed to push your way into institutions to see how these children were being treated. And she used her name and her forceful personality, and she barged into places all over the world. And maybe because she was President Kennedy's sister, she cracked open the door. And now all over the world, millions of children have dignity that didn't have dignity. I make this assertion without any disparagement of Senator Edward Kennedy's accomplishments. His 47 years in the Senate are a testament to what makes a great lawmaker. Jackie and Bobby's lives were cut short. They left a wonderful legacy, but they didn't get the full life that Eunice got. And up until the last moment of her 88th year, she was still haranguing people about amendments to the Americans with Disabilities Act.
So I just want to say, in ending this segment of the program, that the one thing I think Eunice was missing was somebody giving voice to all that she had done and telling us why she mattered. And there's only one book in the world that will do that. And so I want to begin by how I ended my part of the program, which is saying there'll be a line in the back, and buy one for yourself, buy one for your gifts for Christmas and Mother's Day and everything else. And I think that because it really does tell a story that has been missing. And the idea that you could say that about anything Kennedy related, that a story is actually missing out there. And that's a tribute not just to the fact that it was the first important biography and that you got all this great material, but that you did true justice to her. I think what we're going to do now is take questions. How do we do this? People come to microphones? Great. So come to microphones, and we'd love to hear your questions.
We have a lot of lights in our eyes.
Great. Now,
that's better.
There is a microphone.
Oh, there's
great.
people out there. Hi.
Come. Sir, first question.
First of all, is there time for CNN to add an addendum to their program? You speak as interestingly as you write, and it makes it fascinating. I think any of us who went to parochial school had that sister in school. So I think that's, she may have not taken the holy vows, but she carried on in that way. Although she's a lot like Katharine Hepburn from what you describe. A question about the Addison's disease, because they say that that affected Jack Kennedy's personality and they became more risk takers than people who don't have it. Is that perhaps part of her personality? That, I don't know what other diseases she had, but Addison can affect that.
I don't know about that. I don't think I would say that because she was as fierce at 14, long before she was diagnosed with that disease, as she was at 80. So I don't think it was that. I think it was something else, something deeper.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. A question over here.
My question to you is, did any of Kennedy's children ever stand up to Joe as an anti-Semitic, a pro-Nazi, a bootlegger, and all the other things he was? Did they ever stand up, any of them stand up face to face and say, Dad, you're wrong?
What a benign question. I read The Patriarch pretty carefully, and I don't think we've established that Joe was a bootlegger. I mean, we know that he imported Haig and Haig, but no, I don't think they did. I don't think they did.
Where the money come from, you shut up.
Pardon me?
Where the money comes from, you just keep your mouth shut.
Well, I think they all loved their father. I think this is a very interesting thing about the Kennedys. I mean, people have very strong feelings about this family. But they are a family, don't forget. And whatever you think of any of their politics, he was their dad, and he was a present father. Even when he was away, he wrote them all the time. The files upstairs are full of his letters to his kids. They knew that their careers and their lives were dependent on him in many ways, that his encouragement and his money.
So this is about you, not me, but can I take a quick
Yes.
shot at that? I think most of what the Kennedy kids did during their lives, they didn't stand up to him by confronting him, but most of what they did during their public lives was confronting him. Everything in your book convinced me that Eunice Kennedy's life was shaped by what Joe did in banishing and lobotomizing Rosemary and standing
That's
up.
right.
That's a profound way. Bobby Kennedy started his public life with the stigma of having grown up with a father who was an anti-Semite and the question about whether he was anti-Semitic. And at the end of his life, he was killed because he was too pro-Semitic. Sirhan said, I killed him because he was too supportive of Israel and the Jews. That I think what they did in their public lives was a more profound way of standing up to Joe Kennedy than actually confronting their aging father.
But when they were over in England, and when he was an ambassador, and he was he was pro-Nazi, what were their feelings toward him? They must have had some feelings.
Well,
They were little kids.
I think I'm gonna leave it with what Larry said. I mean, I think the motto of the Special Olympics says it all. We've talked about how Joe's motto was only first place finishers count. What's the motto of Special Olympics? Let me win, but if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt.
And saying that as the daughter of Joe Kennedy was saying a lot. A question there?
You brought up so many, you enriched the story of Eunice for someone, who's known about her for a long time. Gunnar Dibwad.
Leo.
Yes.
Hi.
Gunnar, how you doing?
Good.
Gunnar Dibwad, who's also at Brandeis.
Yes.
Made a big deal about the Saturday Evening Post. And now that you've talked about Eunice tonight and sort of opened my eyes in a different way about her, I've got to say, could you talk about that Saturday Evening Post article? Because I think, given what you're saying about her, that's before Special Olympics, right?
Right.
And
It's
he was,
way before.
And he was still pretty with it, I would think.
No, he wasn't.
He wasn't in 59, 60? Okay.
She wrote that article in 1962. This is an
62,
article
okay.
that
Go
Eunice
ahead.
wrote in 1962 for Saturday Evening Post. And it's when the family revealed that Rosemary had what we then call mental retardation. And this was a revolutionary piece. For one thing, they were telling the truth. For years, they had said that she was teaching children in a school for the mentally retarded in Wisconsin, when in fact she was a resident there. This piece is extraordinary for a couple of reasons. One, she didn't write it. Of course she didn't write it. None of them wrote anything. That's That's what we do for a living. But the fellow that they got to write it tells hilarious stories about being flown into Hyannisport and basically locked on one of those porches, watching the sea come in while she brought reams and reams of research material and told him, right. And when it didn't sound enough like Jack, she'd say, write it again. It doesn't sound enough like Jack. And this was her piece. But she did have a thing about her brother. And he tells the story of how President Kennedy would come through the porch and say, have you seen Eunice? Eunice, it's time to go sailing. And every once in a while I'd look up and think, oh, that's where I am. This is what I'm doing. But the piece had a remarkable, remarkable impact because nobody had talked about this issue publicly before. And because she was a Kennedy, it had an enormous impact. People felt free to talk about the situation in their own family. But it is worth noting that the piece was published in September of 1962, and Joe Kennedy had his stroke in December of 1961.
So before we take the next question, I just want to make a quick comment. Eileen just demonstrated in graphic form how she gave voice to Eunice Shriver. That voice is brilliant. Most people don't have the courage, most authors don't have the courage to ever try to imitate a Kennedy. Nicely done. That was got a question there.
Eunice Kennedy Shriver was a Kennedy by birth and a Shriver by marriage.
Yes.
And you've pointed out sometimes some of the conflict that occurred between Sargent Shriver and members of the Kennedy family regarding some positions, or rather posts he took that were political posts. Mm-hmm. What effect, if any, and how, if there was a conflict, how did that resolve between Eunice and Bobby and whatever family members might have been offended by some of the political opportunities that Sargent Shriver took advantage of?
Well, I think there were 2 points, I think Larry would agree with me, of real contention between Bobby and Sarge. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson asked Sarge to run a war on poverty. This was something Bobby resented because he and Jack, before Jack's assassination, had talked about a major assault on the poverty issue. And he thought that was his portfolio. Arguably, Bobby thought everything was his portfolio, I would say. And Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Kennedy could not tolerate one another. So part of him giving it to Sarge, I'm sure, was to stick it to Bobby. The second occurrence, Eunice told him to take the job. He said he didn't want to take the job because he loved the Peace Corps, and he wanted to stay in the Peace Corps. But I found a letter from her where she said, you know, if the president asks you to do it, you do it. You have to do it. And the second conflict was in 1968, when Lyndon Johnson, before he had announced that he would not stand for re-election, asked Sargent Shriver to be his ambassador to France. Did he suspect that Bobby might run? Maybe he did. Bobby was certainly talking about running in late 67, didn't run until after G. McCarthy did well in New Hampshire, it's true, but the thought was that he was out there. This was an opportunity for Sarge to stand on his own, to do something on his own. He accepts the position, and 20 seconds later, Bobby announces he's running for the presidency. And I have to say, a lot of Sargent's friends said to me, she always stood with the Kennedy brothers instead of standing with Sarge. And in 1968, she stood with Sarge. Emissary after emissary came out to Timberlawn, their estate in Maryland, and said, you have to go to Indiana for Bobby. You have to stay and work for Bobby. Sarge, you have to be part of the campaign. And Eunice said, and I quote, we're going to be ambassadors to France. How's that? And note that she said we, and she said ambassadors. And she wanted to go to France. She loved her time in France, and she thought Sarge was entitled to something of his own. And but she split the baby. Sarge went in early April to France. She went to Indiana and campaigned for Bobby, and then flew to France after the Indiana primary.
Very diplomatic.
Yeah.
So one quick comment on that. When Bobby, in 1964, when LBJ was about to accept the presidency, he was looking around for a vice president.
Right.
And he, I think, just to tweak Bobby, suggested it was going to be Sargent Shriver. And Bobby's famous response was, if it's going to be a Kennedy, it would be a real Kennedy. And that was the ultimate put down of Sargent Shriver, who was as close to a real Kennedy in every way as you could get.
Yeah.
And so I think Eunice made a great decision in '68 by sticking by. And it was a brilliant move by LBJ to take Shriver and Eunice out of the campaign.
Oh, there's no question that there was a political calculation there. He didn't want Sargent and Eunice in the country if he was running, campaigning against him.
Question.
Hi, Eileen. Could you talk about Eunice's relationship with her two younger sisters?
With her two younger sisters. Yes. Oh, with Pat and Jean.
Yes.
Very close to Pat, not as close to Jean, but the sisters were Kennedy close. How's that?
But
she and Pat were very close, I think.
But she was so different than her sisters.
Yeah.
Jean ends up later on serving as ambassador to Ireland, but was certainly compared to Eunice a meek presence. How did Eunice turn out so differently?
Because Eunice is Eunice, and she's not like the others. They both had ambitions. Jean wanted either to be a nurse or a doctor. She talks about it, that her father said no, it was unseemly for a woman to be in medicine, even though the doctor in the White House was Janet Travel, who was a woman when Jack was there. Pat had a great business head. They thought she would like to be a businesswoman. Joe vetoed that. So Eunice is the only one that broke out of the box. And yes, Jean was the ambassador to Ireland because Ted said it's time for Jean to have something. So Clinton named her ambassador to Ireland and, you know, did a nice job at it. And while she was there, peace came to Northern Ireland, but I don't think she had anything to do with it. I think George Mitchell did, but I don't think she did.
Questions, sir?
Great discussion. Got here a little late, so I'm not sure whether you may have said something in the very beginning about this, but you've both written excellent biographies about two members of the Kennedy family that, to me, in your description, sound most close in personality, the intensity, the passion, Bobby, that is, and Eunice. Would you agree with that as to begin with? And secondly, well, let's leave that alone.
Okay, I would say yes. She's closer to Bobby. She wanted to be Jack, but she didn't. Excuse me. She didn't have Jack's smoothness and disposition. You know, she had a mercurial personality. The idea that she would ever be elected to public office is probably remote because she was kind of prickly, just as Bobby was prickly. But what what they had, they didn't move as smoothly through life as Jack Kennedy did. I think life was harder for them. Bobby was the run of the litter. She was a girl. I think they internalized that. And the compassion that they both had for the disenfranchised, you know, comes through in every pore of their being. I'm not saying Jack Kennedy didn't have that, but I don't think he had it, at least in the early 60s. Would he have had it later on that Bobby did and that Eunice did?
Some said Bobby would have been, in later years, a radical priest, you know, in his own ways, which sounds a lot like her. I'm curious who would have won a tennis match between Bobby and Eunice.
She would have killed him.
Really? Really? Yeah. But last serious question beyond that. What about her suspicions about the assassinations of two of her brothers? Did she have any thinking about the possibility that there was CIA involvement, FBI involvement? You know, a lot has been written on this, so I wonder.
Kennedys don't look back.
Okay.
They look forward. They don't look back. None of the Shriver children ever had a conversation with their mother about the assassinations of their uncle. That was extraordinary to me. Anthony told me that if it came on television, a special about the assassinations, she turned it off and said, "Oh, go sail." It wasn't a topic of conversation, and it was not a preoccupation of hers. What was past, and she didn't want it re-examined. Mark may have been, one of her children was at the Potomac School with one of Ethel's children at the time, and this was coming up as a history lesson. And she showed up at the Potomac School, and she took both of them out of the school so that they wouldn't.
Thank you.
Sir?
First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for this book. I work for Special Olympics, and I remember back in 1995, I went down to Washington, D.C., and I was given a tour of the office. And we said, okay, now look through this window, and then if you look out, it goes across an alleyway, and you can see into another window, and that's where Mrs. Shriver's office is. We don't go in there unless she calls us.
That's great. I want you to know that Mrs. Shriver's office is preserved exactly as it was when she left it. Yeah. It's locked, and I asked him if I could go into the inner sanctum, and a piece of paper blew off the table, and I said, didn't stay long, but I think she's still there. Yeah. I think she's still there.
So it's wonderful that you've written this book. There's so many of us that have been looking and waiting to hear more and more about her. And I was just wondering, she sounded like a prolific letter writer and had lots of talk. Did she have any type of memoirs that she was putting together at all?
No. I mean, that would not have been Eunice's style. And she would be horrified by this book. Yeah. She would be. I sent it to one of her close friends when it was in manuscript form. And when Dita Blair is a socialite and a philanthropist on medical issues in New York. And when Dita got to the parts in the book that were about her physical condition, she said, oh, no, Eunice would want that out. You've got to take that out. And I'd say, well, Eunice isn't here. It's staying in.
Thank you.
So the only one of those children, of the 9 children who wrote anything that could legitimately be called a memoir, I think was Ted. And
right.
I think the,
right.
And it says a lot maybe about how he was different than the others. He actually showed feeling and emotion and let some of that come out in his
That's right.
memoir.
Yes, I was just wondering, in some of her early diaries that you said, is there at one point that you see that sense of anger come out because of how people would look at somebody as Rosemary? Because when Eunice was here at the library one day, she attributed Jack's sense of compassion to living with somebody that was challenged, such as Rosemary. So I was wondering if there was one point in her life that kind of solidified it, or it was an awakening for her?
Yeah, there's no psychological awakening in Eunice's writings. I mean, what I loved about them, in fact, was in some ways how pedestrian they were. When she was a debutante preparing for all these parties or had just gone to some luncheon, she would say, had a lovely time, dash, was such a lovely girl to meet. She didn't remember anybody's name, so there were dashes all through the diary. I thought, that'll be useful for you when you read that years later, Eunice. No, I don't think there was one thing like that. And I also think it's important to know that she projected on to Jack her feelings and her thoughts about intellectual disabilities. I don't think Jack had a thought in his head about intellectual disabilities. He's no record in the Senate. His record in the Senate is absent. He walked out of a hearing room. The only bill that had been passed before the Kennedy administration was to provide some federal funding for special education teachers. And a brilliant woman who was going to testify at that hearing was infuriated to see Senator Jack Kennedy brush right past her out of the hearing room and not stick around to hear her testimony. So I think there's a lot of projection going on.
So she stands as even higher in character now.
I think she does,
So
and
you
I
brought
think
that out for her.
And she also was politically savvy enough to know that if I don't say that this is Jack,
Right.
who am I? I'm just his sister.
Right.
I mean, who is Eunice Shriver? All across this country, as I did interviews. Well, wait a minute. Is she the one with 11 kids? No, that's Ethel. Is she Maria's mother? Yes. Is she Sargent Shriver's wife? Yes. But she's also herself.
So thank you once again for bringing her importance to life.
Thank you.
So let's take one more question here.
I'm so sorry. I was 2 hours on Route 93 getting here.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I just came. So
Oh,
I have
I'm
no
so
idea what you
sorry.
talked about. When this lady mentioned the word compassion, I had to come up because I don't know what you talked about, but would not all of the Kennedys, I hope, think that the term compassion really is what has to be done in these schools and the businesses? And I mean, we just had another one right now. We're having another attack in California right now.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to teach it, they have to work with it. I'm a poet, and I think that poetry is one of the best ways to do that, and artwork.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered what
Well, I think Eunice would agree with you. She started a program in the 80s that still exists in thousands of schools all across this country, in middle schools and high schools, and it's called Communities of Caring, and it's run now out of the University of Utah. But she started it, and the idea was to stop bullying of intellectually disabled kids.
Yeah.
But now it's got a much broader curriculum, which is trying to deal with the whole bullying issue in general.
she would never have understood how it was now. I mean, it's just the bullying is so pervasive everywhere. Everywhere.
Right.
Even adults.
Thank you. I'm sorry for your traffic woes.
So I want to end by just saying I've already made the pitch that you should go out and buy books for every relative that you can think of.
Is he on the Home Shopping Network and I don't know?
It is a home shopping. So I want to make just one more pitch, and this is an easy pitch after the performance that Eileen just put on, and that is a pitch that if you were part of a big enough group out there to justify her coming, I can't imagine two combinations, a combination that makes more sense. A person in our world who we should know about, who we don't, like Eunice Shriver, and a person who can bring them alive as a speaker like Eileen McNamara just proved that she can do. So have her in as a speaker, buy her book, and give her a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
Thank you.